Mr. President, friends, and fellow citizens, for the purpose of this celebration, is the 4th of July. It is the birthday of your national independence and your political freedom. This to you is what the Passover was to the emancipated people of God. It carries your minds back to the day and to the act of your great deliverance and to the signs and to the wonders associated with that act and that day. This celebration also marks the beginning of another year of your national life and remind you that the Republic of America is now 76 years old. I'm glad, fellow citizens, that your nation is so young. 76 years of a good old age for a man is a mere speck in the life of a nation. 80 years and 10 is the allotted time of individual men. But nations number their years by thousands. According to this fact, you are now, even now, only in the beginning of your national career. Still, the lingering period of childhood. I repeat, I am glad this is so. There's hope in this thought. And hope is much needed under the dark clouds which lower above the horizon. Fellow citizens, I shall not presume or dwell at length on the associations that cluster about this day. The simple story is that 76 years ago, the people of this country were British subjects. The style and title of your sovereign people, in what you now glory, was not then yet born. You were under the British crown. Your fathers esteemed the English government as the home government. And England as the fatherland. This home government, you know, although a considerable distance from your home, did, in the exercise of its parental prerogatives, impose upon its colonial children such restraints, burdens, and limitations as, in its mature judgment, it deemed wise, right, and proper. But your fathers, who had not adopted the fashionable idea of this day, of the infallibility of government and the absolute character of its acts, presumed to differ from the home government in respect to wisdom and justice of some of those burdens and restraints. They were so far in their excitement as to pronounce the measures of government unjust and unreasonable, oppressive, altogether such as ought not be quietly submitted to. I scarcely need to say, fellow citizens, that my opinion of those measures fully accords with that of your fathers. Feeling themselves harshly and unjustly treated by the home government. Your fathers, like men of honesty and men of spirit, earnestly sought redress. Their conduct was wholly unexceptionable. This, however, did not answer the purpose. They saw themselves treated with sovereign indifference, coldness, and scorn. Yet they persevered. They were not the men to look back. As the sheet anchor takes a firmer hold when the ship is tossed by the storm, so did the cause of your fathers grow stronger as it breasted the chilling blast of kingly displeasure. The greatest and best of British statesmen admitted its justice, and the loftiest eloquence of the British Senate came to its support, but with that blindness which seems to be the unvarying characteristic of tyrants. Since Pharaoh and his host were drowned in the Red Sea, the British government persisted in the exactions complained of. The madness of this course, we believe, is admitted now, even by England, but we fear the lesson is wholly lost on our present ruler. Oppression makes a wise man mad. Your fathers were wise men. And if they did not go mad, they became restive under their treatment. They felt themselves the victims of grievous wrongs, wholly incurable in their colonial capacity. With brave men, there is always a remedy for oppression. Just here, the idea of total separation of the colonies from the crown was born. It was a startling idea. So much so, then we at this distance of time regarded the timid, prudent, as has been intimated, of that day were, of course, shocked and alarmed by it. Such people lived then, had lived before, and will probably ever have a place on this planet. And their course, in respect to any great change, no matter how great the good to be attained or the wrong to be addressed by it, may be calculated with as much precision as can be the course of the stars. They hate all changes but silver, gold, and copper change. Of this sort of change, they are always strongly in favor. These people were called Tories in the days of your fathers. And the appellation probably conveyed the same idea that is meant by a more modern, though a somewhat less euphonious term, which we often find in our papers applied to some of our old politicians. Their opposition to the then dangerous thought was earnest and powerful, but amid all their terror and affrighted vociferations against it, the alarming and revolutionary idea moved on, and the country with it. On the 2nd of July, 1776, the old Centennial Congress, to the dismay of the lovers of ease and the worshipers of property, clothed that dreadful idea with all the authority of national sanction. They did so in the form of a resolution. And as we seldom hit upon resolutions drawn up in our day whose transparency is at all equal to this, it may refresh your minds and help my story if I read it. Resolve that these united colonies are, and of right, ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be dissolved. Citizens, your fathers made good that resolution. And they succeeded, and today you reap the fruits of their success. The freedom gained is yours. And you, therefore, may properly celebrate this anniversary. The 4th of July is the first great fact in your nation's history. The very high ring bolt in the chain of your yet undeveloped destiny. Pride and patriotism, not less than gratitude, prompt you to celebrate and to hold it in perpetual remembrance. I have said that the Declaration of Independence is the ring bolt to the chain of your nation's destiny. And so indeed, I regard it. The principles contained in that instrument are saving principles. Stand by those principles. Be true to them on all occasions, in places, against all foes, at whatever cost. Fellow citizens, I am not wanting in respect to the fathers of this republic. The signers of the Declaration of Independence were brave men. They were great men too. Great enough to give fame to a great age. It does not often happen to a nation to raise at one time such a number of truly great men. The point at which I'm compelled to view them is not certainly the most favorable, and yet I cannot contemplate their great deeds with less admiration. They were statesmen, patriots, heroes. And for the good they did and the principles they contended for, I will unite with you to honor their memory. They loved their country better than their own private interests. And though this is not the highest form of human excellence, all will concede that it is a rare virtue, and that when it is exhibited, it ought to command respect. He who will intelligently lay down his life for his country is a man whom it is not in human nature to despise. Your fathers staked their lives for their fortunes and their sacred honor on the cause of their country and the admiration of their liberty. They lost sight of all other interests. They were peacemen, but they preferred revolution to peaceful submission to bondage. They were quiet men, but they did not shrink from agitating against the oppressor. They showed forbearance, but they knew their limits. They believed in order, but not in the order of tyranny. With them, nothing was settled that was not right. With them, justice, liberty, and humanity were final, not slavery and oppression. You may well cherish the memory of such men. They were great in their day, in their generation. And their solid manhood stands out more as we contrast it with these degenerate times. The present? My business, if I have any here today, is with the present. The accepted time with God and his cause is the ever-living now. Trust no future, however pleasant. Let the dead past bury its dead. Act. Act in the living present. Heart within and God overhead. We have to do with this past only what we can make it useful to the present and to the future. To all inspiring motives, to noble deeds which can be gained from the past. We are welcome. But now it is the time, the important time. Your fathers have lived, died, and have done their work, and have done much of it well. You must live, die, and you must do your work. You have no right to enjoy a child's share in the labors of your fathers unless your children are to be blessed by your labors. You have no right to wear out and waste the hard-earned fame of your fathers to cover your indolence. Washington could not die until he had broken the chains of his slaves. Yet, his monument is built up by the price of human blood. And the traitors in the bodies of souls of men shout, "We have Washington to our father." Alas, that it should be so, yet so it is. Evil that men do lives after them. Their good is often interred with their bones. What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in the Declaration of Independence extended to us? And am I therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessing resulting from your independence to us? Would God, for both your sakes and ours, that an affirmative answer could be truthfully returned to these questions. Then would my task be light and my burdens easy and delightful. But such is not the case. I say this with a sad sense of disparity between us. I am not included within the pale of this glorious anniversary. Your high independence only reveals the immeasurable distance between us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoyed in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man into the fetters of grand illuminated temples of liberty and to call upon him to join you in the joyous anthems were inhuman mockery and sacrilege irony. Do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me today to speak here? Fellow citizens, above your national tumultuous joy, I hear the mournful wail of millions whose chains, heavy with grievous yesterdays, are today rendered more intolerable by the shouts of jubilee and the shouts that reach them. If I do forget, if I do not faithfully remember those bleeding children of sorrow today, may my right hand forget her cunning, and may my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. To forget them, to pass lightly over their wrongs, and to chime in with the popular theme would be treason most scandalous and shocking, and would make me a reproach before God and the world. My subject then, fellow citizens, is American slavery. I shall see this day and its popular characteristics from the slave's point of view. Standing there, identified with the American bondsman, making his wrongs mine, I do not hesitate to declare with all my soul that the character and conduct of this nation never looked blacker to me than on this 4th of July. Whether we turn to the declarations of the past or the professions of the present, or the conduct of this nation seems equally hideous and revolting. America is false to past, false to present, and solemnly binds herself to be false to the future, standing with God and the crushed and bleeding slave on this occasion. I will, in the name of humanity, which is outraged, in the name of liberty, which is fettered, in the name of the Constitution and the Bible, which are disregarded and trampled upon, dare to call in question and to denounce, with all the emphasis I can command, everything that serves to perpetuate slavery, the great sin and shame of America. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will use the severest language I can command, and yet not one word shall escape me that any man whose judgment is not blinded by prejudice, or who is not at all a slave holder at heart, shall not confess to be right and just. But I fancy I hear somebody in the audience say, it is just in this circumstance that you and your brother abolitionists failed to make a favorable impression on the public mind. Would you argue more and denounce less? Would you persuade more and rebuke less? Your cause would be much more likely to succeed, but I submit, where all is plain, there is nothing to be argued. What point in the anti-slavery creed would you have me argue? On what branch of the subject do the people of this country need light? Must I undertake to prove that the slave is a man? That point is conceded already. Nobody doubts it. The slave owners themselves acknowledge it in the enactment of laws for their government. They acknowledge it when they punish disobedience on the part of the slave. There are 72 crimes in the state of Virginia, which, if committed by a black man, no matter how ignorant he may be, subject him to the punishment of death. While only 2 of the same crimes will subject the white man to like punishment. What is this but the acknowledgement that the slave is moral, intellectual, and a responsible being? The manhood of the slave is conceded. It is admitted in the fact that the Southern statute books are covered with enactments forbidding, under severe fines and penalties, the teaching of the slave to read or write. When you can point to any such laws in the reference to the beasts of the field, then I may consent to argue the manhood of the slave. For the present, it is enough to affirm the equal manhood of the Negro race. Is it not astonishing that while we are plowing and planting and reaping and using all kinds of mechanical tools, erecting houses, constructing bridges, building ships, working in metals of brass, iron, copper, silver, and gold, that while we are reading, writing, ciphering, acting as clerks, merchants, secretaries, having among us lawyers and doctors, ministers, poets, authors, editors, orators, teachers, that while we are engaged in all manner of enterprises common to other men, digging gold in California, capturing the whale in the Pacific, feeding sheep and cattle on the hillside, living, moving, acting, thinking, planning, living in families as husbands, wives, and children. And above all, confessing and worshiping the Christian's God, and looking hopefully for life and immortality beyond the grave. We are called upon to prove we are men. Would you have me argue that we are entitled to liberty? That he is the rightful owner of his own body? You have already declared it. Must I argue the wrongfulness of slavery? Is that a question for the Republicans? Is it to be settled by the rules of logic and argumentation as a matter beset with great difficulty, involving a doubtful application of the principles of justice, hard to be understood? There is not a man beneath the canopy of heaven that does not know that slavery is wrong for him. What am I to argue that is wrong? To make men brutes, to rob them of their liberty, to work them without wages, to keep them ignorant of their relations to their fellow men, to beat them with sticks, to lay their flesh with the lash, to load their limbs with irons, to hunt them with dogs, to sell them at auction, to sunder their families, to knock out their teeth, to burn their flesh, to starve them in obedience and submission to their masters. Must I argue that a system thus marked with blood and stained with pollution is wrong? No, I will not. I have better employments for my time and strength than such arguments would imply. What then remains to be argued? Is it that slavery is not divine? That God did not establish it? That our doctors of divinity are mistaken? There's blasphemy in the thought. That which is inhuman cannot be divine. Who can reason on such a proposition? They that can, may. I cannot. The time for such an argument is past. At a time like this, the scorching irony, not convincing argument is needed. Oh, had I the ability, I could reach the nation's ear. I would today pour out a fiery stream of biting ridicule, blasting reproach, withering sarcasm, and stern rebuke. For it is not the light that is needed, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need a storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake. The feeling of the nation must be quickened. The conscience of the nation must be roused. The propriety of the nation must be startled. The hypocrisy of the nation must be exposed. And its crimes against God and man must be proclaimed and denounced. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days of the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness a swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty, heartless. Your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence. Your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery. Your prayers and hymns. Your services and thanksgivings. With all your religious parade and solemnity are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy. A thin veil to cover up crimes that would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practices more shocking and bloody than are the people of these United States at this very hour. Go where you may, search where you will, roam throughout all the monarchies and despotisms of the old world, travel through South America, search out every abuse, and when you have found the last, lay your facts side by side of the everyday practices of this nation. And you will say that me, for the revolting barbarity and shameless hypocrisy, America reigns without rival. Take the American slave trade, which we are told by the American papers are especially prosperous right now. Ex-Senator Benton tells us that the price of men was never higher than it is now. He mentions that fact to show that slavery is no longer a danger. This trade is one of the peculiarities of American institutions. It is carried on in all the large towns and cities in one half of this Confederacy. And millions are pocketed every year by dealers in this horrid traffic. In several states, this trade is chief source of wealth. It is called, in contradistinction to the foreign slave trade, the internal slave trade. It is probably called so too in order to divert from the horror with which the foreign slave trade is contemplated. The trade has long since been denounced by this government as piracy. It has been denounced with burning words from high places in the nation as an exacerbable traffic. To arrest it, to put an end to it, this nation keeps a squadron at immense cost on the east coast of Africa. Everywhere in this country, it is safe to speak of this foreign slave trade as the most inhuman traffic. Opposed alike to the laws of God and man. The duty to extirpate and destroy it is admitted even by our doctors of divinity. In order to put an end to it, some of these last have consented that their colored brethren, nominally free, should leave this country and establish themselves on the western coast of Africa. It is, however, a notable fact that while so much execration is poured out by the Americans upon those engaged in the foreign slave trade, the men engaged in the slave trade between the states pass without condemnation, and their business is deemed honorable. Behold the practical oppression of this internal slave trade, the American slave trade, sustained by American politics and American religion. Here you will see men and women reared like swine in the market. You know what a swine drover is? I will show you a man drover. They inhabit all of our southern states. They preambulate the country and crowd the highways of the nation with droves of human stock. You will see one of these human flesh jobbers armed with pistol, whip, and bowie knife, driving a company of 100 men and women from the Potomac to the slave market at New Orleans. These wretched people are sold singly or in lots to suit purchasers. They are food for the cotton field and the deadly sugar mill. Mark the sad procession as it moves wearily along, and the human wretch who drives them. Hear this savage yells and his blood-chilling oaths as he hurries on his affrighted captives. There you see the old man with the locks thinned and gray. Cast one look, if you please, upon that young mother whose shoulders are bare to the scorching sun. Her briny tears falling to the brow of the babe in her arms. See, too, that girl of 13 weeping, yes, weeping. Weeping as she thinks on the mother from whom she has been torn. The drove moves tardily. Heat and sorrow have nearly consumed their strength. Suddenly, you hear a quick snap, like the discharge of a rifle. The fetters clank and the chain rattles simultaneously. Your ears are saluted with a scream that seems to have torn its way to the center of your soul. The crack you heard was the sound of a slave whip. The scream you heard was from a young woman you saw with a babe. Her speed had faltered under the weight of her child and her chains. That gash on her shoulder tells her to move on. Follow the drove to New Orleans. Attend the auction. See the men examined like horses. See the forms of women rudely and brutally exposed to the shocking gaze of American slave buyers. See the drove sold and separated forever. And never get to keep. And never forget the deep, sad sobs that rose from the scattered multitudes. Tell me, citizens, where under the sun can you witness a spectacle more fiendish and shocking? Yet, this is but a glance at the American slave trade as it exists at this moment in the ruling parts of the United States. I was born amid such sights and scenes. To me, the American slave trade is a terrible reality. When a child, my soul was often pierced with the sense of its horrors. I lived on Philpott Street, Fells Point, Baltimore, and have watched from the wharves the slave ships in the basin, anchored from the shore, with their cargoes of human flesh, waiting for favorable winds to waft them down the Chesapeake. There was at that time a grand slave mart kept at the head of Pratt Street by Austin Woldfolk. His agents were sent into every town and county in Maryland, announcing their arrival through the papers and on flaming handbills, headed "Cash for Negroes." These men were generally well-dressed and very captivating in manners, ever ready to eat and drink and treat and gamble. The fate of many slaves has depended upon the turn of a single card. And many a child has been snatched from the arms of its mother by bargains arranged in a state of brutal drunkenness. The fleshmongers gather up their victims by the dozens and drive them chained to the General Depot at Baltimore. When a sufficient number have been collected there, a ship is chartered for the purpose of conveying the forlorn crew to Mobile or New Orleans. From the slave prison to the ship, they are usually driven in the darkness of night. For since the anti-slavery agitation, a certain caution is observed. In the deep, still darkness of midnight, I have been often aroused by the dead, heavy footsteps and the piteous cries of the chain gangs that passed our door. The anguish of my boyish heart was intense, and I was often consoled when speaking to my mistress in the morning to hear her say that the custom was very wicked, that she hated to hear the rattle of the chains and the heart-rending cries. I was glad to find one who sympathized with me in my horror. Fellow citizens, this murderous traffic is today in active operation in this boasted republic. In the solitude of my spirit, I see clouds of dust raised on highways of the South. I see bleeding footsteps. I hear the doleful wails of fettered humanity on the way to slave markets where the victims are sold like horses, sheep, and swine, knocked off to the highest bidder. There, I see the tenderest ties ruthlessly broken to gratify the lust, caprice, and rapacity of the buyers and sellers of men. My soul sickens at the sight. Is this the land your fathers loved? The freedom which they toiled to win? Is this the earth whereon they moved? Are these the graves they slumber in? But still, more inhuman and disgraceful and scandalous state of things remains to be presented. By an act of American Congress, not yet 2 years old, slavery has been nationalized in its most horrible and revolting form. By that act, Mason and Dixon's line has been obliterated. New York has become as Virginia, and the power to hold, hunt, and sell men and women and children as slaves remains no longer a mere state institution, but it is now an institution of the whole United States. The power is coextensive with the Star-Spangled Banner and American Christianity. Where these go, may also go the merciless slave hunter. Where these are, man is not scared. He is a bird for a sportsman's gun. By that most foul and fiendish of all decrees, the liberty of and person of every man are put in peril. Your broad Republican domain is a hunting ground for men, not for thieves and robbers, enemies of society merely, but for men guilty of no crime. Your lawmakers have commanded all good citizens to engage in this hellish sport. Your president, your secretary of state, your lords and nobles and ecclesiastes enforce as a duty you owe to your free and glorious country and to your God that you do this accursed thing. Not fewer than 40 Americans have within the past 2 years been hunted down and without a moment's warning hurried away in chains and consigned to slavery and excruciating torture. Some of these have had wives and children. Depended upon them for bread, but for this no account was made. The right of the hunter to his prey stands superior to the right of marriage and all the rights of the republic and the rights of God included, for black men. There were neither law, justice, humanity, nor religion. Nor religion. The fugitive slave law makes mercy to them a crime and bribes the judge who tries them. An American judge gets $10 for every victim he consigns to slavery, and $5 when he fails to do so. The oath of any two villains is sufficient under his hell black enactment to send the most pious and exemplary black man into the remorseless jaws of slavery. His own testimony is nothing. He can bring no witness for himself. The minister of the American justice is bound by the law to hear but one side. And that side is the side of the oppressor. Let this damning fact be perpetually told. Let it be thundered around the world that a tyrant-killing, king-hating, people-loving, democratic Christian America, the seats of justice are filled with judges who hold their offices under an open and palpable bribe and are bound in the deciding in the case of a man's liberty, hear only his accusers. In glaring violation of justice, in shameless disregard of the forms of administering law, in the cunning arrangement to entrap the defenseless, and in diabolical intent, this fugitive slave law stands alone in the annals of tyrannical legislation. I doubt if there be another nation on the globe having the brass and baseness to put such law, statute on the books. If any man in this assembly thinks differently from me in this matter and feels able to disprove my statements, I will gladly confront him at any suitable time and place he may select. I take this to be one of the grossest infringements of Christian liberty. And if the churches and ministers of our country were not stupidly blind or most wickedly indifferent, they too would so regard it. At the very moment that they are thanking God for the enjoyment of their civil and religious liberty and the right to worship God according to the dictates of their own consciences, they are utterly silent in respect to a law which robs religion of the chief significance and makes it utterly worthless in a world lying in wickedness. The fact that the church of our country, with fractional exceptions, does not esteem the fugitive slave law as a declaration of war against liberty, religious liberty, implies that the church regards religion simply as a form of worship, an empty ceremony, and not vital principle requiring active benevolence, justice, love, and goodwill towards men. It esteems sacrifice above mercy, psalm singing above right doing, solemn meetings above practical righteousness. A worship that can be conducted by persons who refuse to give shelter to the houseless. A worship that can be conducted by persons who refuse to enjoin obedience to a law forbidding these acts of mercy is a curse. It is not a blessing. Not a blessing to mankind. The Bible addresses all such persons as scribes, Pharisees, and hypocrites who pay the tithe of mint, anise, and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. But the church of this country is not only indifferent to the wrongs of the slave, it actually takes sides with the oppressors. It has made itself a bulwark of American slavery and the shield of American slave hunters, many of its most eloquent divines, who stand as the very lights of the church, are shamelessly given the sanction of religion and the Bible to the whole slave system. They have taught that man may properly be a slave, and that the relation of master and slave are ordained by God. That to send back an escaped bondsman to his master is clearly the duty of a follower, of the followers of Jesus Christ. And this horrible blasphemy is palmed off upon the world for Christianity. For my part, I would say welcome infidelity. Welcome atheism. Welcome anything in preference to the gospel as preached by those divines. They convert the very name of religion into an engine of tyranny and barbarous cruelty, and serve to conform more infidels in this age than all the infidel writings of Thomas Paine, Voltaire, and Bolingbroke put together. These ministers make a religion of cold, flint-hearted thing, having neither principles nor right of action, nor bowels of compassion. They strip the love of God of its beauty and leave the throng of religion a huge, horrible, and repulsive form. It is a religion for oppressors, tyrants, man-stealers, and thugs. It is not that pure and undefiled religion which is from above, and which is first pure, then peaceable, easy to be entreated, full of mercy, and good fruits, without partiality and without hypocrisy. But a religion which favors the rich against the poor, which exalts the proud above the humble, which divides mankind into two classes, tyrants and slaves, which says to the man in chains, stay there, and to the oppressor, oppress on. It is a religion which may be professed and enjoyed by all the robbers and the enslavers of mankind. It makes God a respecter of persons, denies his fatherhood of the race, and tramples in dust the great truth of the brotherhood of man. All this we affirm to be true of the popular church and the popular worship of our land and nation. a religion, a church, and a worship on the authority inspired by wisdom we pronounce to be an abomination in the sight of God. In the language of Isaiah, the American church might be well addressed. Bring no more vain ablutions. Incense is an abomination unto me. The new moons and Sabbaths, the calling of assemblies, I cannot away with. It is iniquity even the solemn meeting. Yea, make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood. Cease to do evil, learn to do well, seek judgment, relieve the oppressed, judge for the fatherless, plead for the widow. The American church is guilty when viewed in connection with what it is doing to uphold slavery, but it's superlatively guilty when viewed in connection with its ability to abolish slavery. The sin of which it is guilty is one of the omission as well as of commission. Albert Barnes but uttered what the common sense of every man at all observant and actual state of the case will receive as truth when he declared that there is no power out of the church that could sustain slavery an hour if it were not sustained in it. Let the religious press, the pulpit, the Sunday school, the conference meeting, the great ecclesiastical, missionary, Bible, and tract associations of the land array their immense powers against slavery and slaveholding, and the whole system of crime and blood would be scattered to the winds. And they that do not do this involves them in the most awful responsibility of which the mind can conceive. In prosecuting the anti-slave enterprise, we have been asked to spare the church, to spare the ministry. But how, we ask, could such a thing be done? We are met on the threshold of our efforts for the redemption of the slave by the church and the ministry of the country in a battle arrayed against us, and we are compelled to fight or flee. From what quarter, I beg to know, has proceeded a fire so deadly upon our ranks during the last 2 years as from the northern pulpit? As the champions of oppressors, the chosen men of American theology have appeared men honored for their so-called piety and their real learning. The Lords of Buffalo, the Springs of New York, the Lathrops of Auburn, the Coxes and Spencers of Brooklyn, the Gannett's and Sharps of Boston, the Deweys of Washington, and other great religious lights of the land, having the utter denial of authority of him by whom they oppressed and professed to be called, the ministry deliberately taught us, against the example of the Hebrews and against the remonstrance of the apostles. They teach that we ought to obey man's law before the law of God. My spirit wearies of such blasphemies, and how such men can be supported as the standing types and representatives of Jesus Christ is a mystery which I leave others to penetrate. In speaking of the American church, however, let it be distinctly understood that I mean the great mass of the religious organizations of our land. There are exceptions. And I thank God that there are. Noble men may be found scattered all over these northern states, of whom Henry Ward Beecher of Brooklyn, Samuel J. May of Syracuse, and my esteemed friend on the platform are shining examples. And let me say further that upon these men lies the duty to inspire our ranks with high religious faith and zeal, and to cheer us on in the great mission of the slave's redemption from his chains. One is struck with the difference between the attitude of the American church toward the anti-slavery movement, and that is occupied by the churches of England towards a similar movement in that country. There, the church, true to its mission of ameliorating, elevating, and improving the conditions of mankind, came forward promptly, bound up the bones of the West Indian slave, and restored him to his liberty. There, the question of liberty was a highly religious question. It was demanded in the name of humanity and according to the law of the living God. The anti-slavery movement there was not an anti-church movement. The reason that the church took its full share in prosecuting that movement and the anti-slavery movement in this country will cease to be an anti-church movement when the church of this country shall assume a favorable instead of hostile position towards that movement. Americans, your Republican politics, not less than your Republican religion, are flagrantly inconsistent. You boast of your love of liberty, your superior civilization, and your pure Christianity, while the whole political power of the nation, as embodied in two great political parties, is solemnly pledged to support and perpetuate the enslavement of 3 million of your countrymen. You hurl your anathemas at the crowded head of tyrants of Russia and Austria. Pride yourself on democratic institutions, while you yourselves consent to be the mere tools and bodyguards of tyrants of Virginia and Carolina. You invite to your shores fugitives of oppression from abroad. Honor them with banquets, greet them with ovations, cheer them, toast them, salute them, protect them, and pour out your money on them like water. But the fugitives from your own land, you advertise, hunt, arrest, shoot, and kill. You glory in your refinement and your universal education, yet you maintain a system as barbarous and dreadful as ever stained the character of a nation. A system begun in avarice, supported in pride, and perpetuated in cruelty. You shed tears over a falling Hungary and make the sad story of her wrongs the theme of your poets, statesmen, and orators, till your gallant sons are ready to fly to the arms to vindicate her cause against her oppressors. But in regard to the 10,000 wrongs of the American slave, you would enforce the strictest silence and would hail him as an enemy of the nation who dares to make those wrongs the subject of public discourse. You are all on fire at the mention of liberty for France or for Ireland, but are cold as an iceberg at the thought of liberty for the enslaved of America. You discourse eloquently on the dignity of labor. Yet you sustain a system which in its very essence casts a stigma upon labor. You can bare your bosom to the storm of British artillery to throw off a 3-penny tax on tea, and yet wring the last hard-earned farthing from the grasp of the black laborers of your country. You profess to believe that of one blood God made all the nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and have commanded all men everywhere to love one another. Yet, you notoriously hate and glory in your hatred. All men whose skins are not colored like your own. You declare before the world and are understood by the world to declare that you hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet you would hold securely in a bondage which, according to your own Thomas Jefferson, is worse than ages in which your fathers rose in rebellion to oppose a 7th part of your inhabitants of this country. Fellow citizens, I will not enlarge further on your national inconsistencies. The existence of slavery in this country brands your republicanism as a sham, your humanity as a base pretense, and your Christianity as a lie. It destroys your moral power abroad. It corrupts your politicians at home. It saps the foundation of religion. It makes your name a hissing and a byword to a mocking earth. It is the antagonistic force in your government, the only thing that seriously disturbs and endangers your union. It fetters your progress. It is the enemy of improvement, the deadly foe of education. It fosters pride, it breeds insolence, it promotes vice, it shelters crime. It is a curse to the earth that supports it, and yet you cling to it as if it were a sheet anchor of all your hopes. Oh! Be warned! Be warned! A horrible reptile is coiled up in your nation's bosom, and the venomous creature is nursing at the tender breast of your youthful republic. For the love of God, tear away and fling from you that hideous monster, and let the weight of 20 million crash and destroy it forever. But it is answered in reply to all this, that precisely what I have now denounced is, in fact, guaranteed and sanctioned by the Constitution of the United States. That the right to hold and hunt slaves is a part of that Constitution framed by the illustrious fathers of this republic. Then, I dare to affirm, notwithstanding all that I've said before, your fathers stooped, basely stooped, to palter with us in a double sense, and to keep the word of promise to the ear, but break it to the heart. And instead of being honest men, I have before declared them to be, they were the veriest impostors that ever practiced on mankind. This is the inevitable conclusion of it from which there is no escape. But I differ from those who charge this baseness on framers of the Constitution of the United States. It is a slander upon their memory. At least so I believe in the Constitution. I hold there is neither warrant, license, nor sanction of the hateful thing, but is interpreted as it ought to be interpreted. The Constitution is a glorious liberty document. Read its preamble. Consider its purposes. Is slavery among them? Is it a gateway? Or is it in the temple? It is neither. While I do not intend to argue this question on the present occasion, let me ask, if it be not somewhat singular that the Constitution were intended to be, by its framers and adopters, a slaveholding instrument, while neither slavery, slaveholding, nor slave can be found in it. Now, there are certain rules of interpretation for the proper understanding of all legal instruments. These rules are well established. They are plain common sense rules, such as you and I and all of us can understand and apply without having passed years in the study of law. I scout that the idea that the question of the constitutionality or unconstitutionality of slavery is not a question for the people. I hold that every American citizen has a fight to form an opinion of the Constitution and to propagate that opinion and to use all honorable means to make his opinion the prevailing one. Now take the Constitution according to its plain reading. And I defy the presentation of a pro-slavery clause in it. On the other hand, it will be found to contain principles and purposes entirely hostile to the existence of slavery. Allow me to say in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented for the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. The arm of the Lord is not shortened, and the doom of slavery is certain. I therefore leave off where I began, with hope. While drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, whose great principles it contains and the genius of American institutions, my spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age. Nations do not now stand in relation to one another as they did ages ago. No nation can shut itself up from the surrounding world and trot in the old paths of its fathers without interference. The time was when such could be done. Long established customs of hurtful character could formally fence themselves in and do their evil work with social impunity. Knowledge was then confined and enjoyed by a privileged few, and the multitude walked on in mental darkness. But a change has now come over the affairs of mankind. Walled cities and empires have become unfashionable. The arm of commerce has borne away the gates of the strong city. Intelligence is penetrating the darkest corners of the globe. It makes its pathway over and under the sea, as well as on the earth. Wind, steam, and lightning are its chartered agents. Oceans no longer divide, but link nations together. From Boston to London is now a holiday excursion. Space is comparatively annihilated. Thoughts expressed on one side of the Atlantic are distinctly heard on the other. The far-off, almost fabulous Pacific rolls in grandeur at our feet. The celestial empire, the mystery of the ages, is being solved. The fiat of the Almighty, "Let there be light," has not yet spent its force. No abuse, no outrage, whether in taste, sport, avarice, can now hide itself from the all-pervading light. The iron shoe and the crippled foot of China must be seen in contrast with nature. Africa must rise and put on her yet unwoven garment. Ethiopia shall stretch out her hand unto God. In the fervent aspirations of William Lord Garrison, I say, and let every man join in saying it, God speed the year of Jubilee, the wide world o'er, when from their galling chains set free, the oppressed shall vilely bend the knee. The weary yoke of tyranny, like brutes no more. That year will come and freedom's reign, to man his plundered rights again restore. God speed the day when human blood shall cease to flow, and every clime be understood in the claims of human brotherhood, and each return evil for good, not blow for blow. That day will come, all feuds to end, and change into a faithful friend each foe.